The year was 793, and the morning mist clung to the shores of Lindisfarne like a death shroud. The monks had risen for their dawn prayers, unaware that their peaceful world was about to be shattered forever. From across the grey waters came the sound that would haunt Europe for the next 3 centuries. The rhythmic splash of oars cutting through the waves, carrying ships filled with warriors whose very name would become synonymous with terror. The Vikings had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same. But here's what the history books often gloss over, what the romanticized tales of Norse mythology conveniently forget to mention. When those longships returned home after their raids, they carried more than just gold and silver. They carried human cargo, women and children torn from their homes, their families, their entire existence, to face a fate that was far more complex and brutal than most people realize. What happened to these captured women has remained one of history's darkest and most misunderstood chapters. The popular imagination, shaped by television shows and Hollywood films, has sanitized their stories into something almost palatable. We see the fierce shield maidens, the respected Norse wives, the tales of honor and warrior culture. But the reality for the thousands of women dragged across the North Sea in Viking longships was infinitely more harrowing and morally complex than anything depicted on screen. Today, we're going to strip away the myths and examine the unflinching truth about what became of the women the Vikings captured. This isn't just about understanding medieval history. It's about confronting the human cost of conquest and the resilience of those who survived the unthinkable. What you're about to learn will challenge everything you thought you knew about Viking society and the women who were forced to become part of it. The Viking Age, spanning roughly from 793 to 1066, was built on a foundation of violence and opportunity. These weren't just random acts of brutality, they were calculated economic ventures. The Scandinavian kingdoms faced overpopulation, limited arable land, and political instability. Raiding offered young men a path to wealth, status, and survival. But wealth in the medieval world wasn't measured only in precious metals. Human beings were commodities, and women represented particularly valuable assets in ways that would horrify modern sensibilities. When Viking longships approached a coastal settlement, the inhabitants faced a terrible choice: fight and likely die, or flee and hope to escape. Those who could neither fight nor flee found themselves at the mercy of warriors who viewed human under. The selection process was metho-capture as just another form of puldical and chilling. Age mattered, physical condition mattered, perceived usefulness mattered. The Vikings weren't taking prisoners out of mercy, they were making calculated investments in human property. The journey back to Scandinavia was itself a form of torture designed to break the spirit before arrival. Packed into the cramped holds of longships never designed for human cargo, captured women endured conditions that defied description. The crossing could take weeks, depending on weather and destination. Food was scarce, fresh water was rationed, and basic sanitation was non-existent. Many didn't survive the voyage, their bodies committed to the cold waters of the North Sea without ceremony or remembrance. Those who survived the crossing faced a world utterly alien to everything they had known. The Norse society that awaited them operated by rules and customs that bore no resemblance to their former lives. But here's where the story becomes more complex than simple victimization. The fate of captured women wasn't uniform. Their treatment, their opportunities, even their eventual freedom depended on factors that were both arbitrary and calculating. The most attractive and young women often found themselves destined for the slave markets of major trading centers like Dublin, York, or Constantinople. These markets were sophisticated operations where human beings were evaluated, priced, and sold like livestock. Contemporary accounts describe the systematic assessment of captives, their health, their skills, their potential for various forms of labor. The most valuable were those who possessed particular abilities, literacy, medical knowledge, fine craftwork, or simply youth and beauty that commanded premium prices. But not all captured women were sold immediately. Many were absorbed directly into Viking households, where they occupied a precarious position that historians struggle to categorize neatly. They weren't family members, but they weren't entirely property either. They existed in a grey area of Norse society that reflected the complex realities of medieval social structures. Some became concubines to wealthy jarls and chieftains, bearing children who might eventually gain recognition and inheritance rights. Others were assigned to domestic labour, working alongside Norse women in the complex hierarchies of large households. The legal status of these women reveals the sophisticated brutality of Viking society. Norse law codes, preserved in later Icelandic sagas and legal documents, contain detailed provisions regarding the treatment and rights of thralls, the Norse word for slaves. These weren't afterthoughts or casual additions to the legal framework. They were integral parts of a society built on human bondage. Thralls could be bought, sold, inherited, and even killed with relatively few legal consequences for their owners. Yet within this system of legalized dehumanization, some captured women found paths to survival and even influence that defy simple narratives of oppression. Intelligence, adaptability, and sheer determination allowed some to navigate the treacherous waters of Norse society. Those who bore sons to their captors often saw their status improve dramatically. In a warrior culture that prized male offspring, a fertile woman who produced healthy boys could find herself elevated from slave to something approaching partnership. The religious dimension of their captivity adds another layer of complexity to their stories. Most captured women were Christians, taken from monasteries, churches, and Christian settlements across Europe. They entered a world where Thor and Odin still commanded genuine reverence, where pagan rituals governed daily life, and where their own faith marked them as foreigners in ways that went beyond language and culture. Some maintained their Christian beliefs in secret, creating underground networks of faith that sustained them through years of bondage. Others converted, whether from genuine conviction or survival instinct, adapting to Norse religious practices as they adapted to everything else in their new lives. The children born of these unions represent perhaps the most tragic aspect of the entire system. Neither fully Norse nor fully foreign, they navigated complex identities in a society that valued clear lineages and tribal affiliations. Some rose to positions of prominence, their mixed heritage eventually becoming a source of strength rather than shame. Others remained forever caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither their mother's culture nor their father's people. Archaeological evidence from across Scandinavia tells the material story of these women's lives. Burial sites reveal the presence of foreign women in Norse communities, identified by jewelry, clothing fragments, and isotope analysis of their remains that indicates non-Scandinavian origins. These silent witnesses to history speak of lives lived far from home, of adaptations made and identities transformed. Some were buried with honors that suggest they achieved significant status within their adopted communities. Others were interred as slaves, their graves unmarked and their stories untold. The economic impact of this human trafficking was staggering. Entire Norse communities depended on slave labor for their prosperity. From the great halls of Norwegian chieftains to the trading posts of Iceland, captured women provided the domestic labor, craft skills, and reproductive capacity that supported Viking expansion. This wasn't incidental to Norse success, it was fundamental to it. The wealth that allowed Vikings to build their impressive ships, craft their legendary weapons, and establish settlements from Greenland to Constantinople was built on the backs of captured workers whose contributions have been largely erased from popular historical memory. But survival required more than just enduring physical hardship and cultural displacement. These women had to learn new languages, new customs, new ways of understanding the world itself. They had to navigate complex social hierarchies where a single misstep could mean death or worse. They had to find ways to preserve their sanity and their humanity in circumstances designed to strip away both. Most remarkably, many succeeded not just in surviving, but in carving out lives of meaning and influence within the very system that had enslaved them. The transformation of these women from victims to participants in Norse society reveals the most disturbing aspect of their ordeal, the gradual erosion of their former identities. Within a generation, many had learned to speak Old Norse fluently, had adopted Scandinavian dress and customs, and had integrated so thoroughly into their new communities that distinguishing them from native-born women became nearly impossible. This wasn't assimilation in any modern sense. It was a form of cultural death and rebirth that required abandoning everything they had once been. The psychological mechanisms that enabled this transformation were both remarkable and heartbreaking. Contemporary accounts, filtered through the perspectives of Norse chroniclers and foreign observers, describe women who had learned to laugh at their captors' jokes, who participated in religious ceremonies honoring the gods of their enslavers, who even defended their new communities against raids from their former homelands. This wasn't Stockholm Syndrome in any simple sense. It was a complex survival strategy that required reinventing themselves completely while carrying the buried trauma of everything they had lost. Some found ways to channel their pain into forms of quiet resistance that have largely escaped historical attention. They taught their children songs from their homeland in whispered moments when their Norse husbands were away. They preserved recipes and craft techniques that connected them to their origins. They created informal networks with other captured women, sharing information and support that helped newcomers navigate the treacherous early months of captivity. These acts of cultural preservation were simultaneously acts of rebellion and survival, ways of maintaining some connection to their authentic selves while adapting to circumstances beyond their control. The seasonal rhythms of Viking society created particular challenges and opportunities for captured women. During the summer months, when the men departed on raids or trading expeditions, the women often found themselves with greater freedom and responsibility. They managed households, supervised agricultural work, and made decisions that would have been impossible in their presence. These periods of relative autonomy allowed some to develop skills and relationships that proved crucial to their long-term survival and advancement within Norse communities. Yet the return of the raiding season brought fresh horrors as new captives arrived to remind them of their own traumatic journeys. Established women were often tasked with managing newcomers, teaching them the basic survival skills necessary to avoid punishment or death. This created complex emotional dynamics where victims became complicit in the system that had victimized them, forced to participate in the breaking and training of other women to ensure their own continued safety and status. The most successful adaptations often involved those women who possessed skills particularly valued in Norse society. Healers and herbalists found their knowledge in high demand, as medieval medicine relied heavily on practical experience rather than formal training. Textile workers discovered that their abilities with needle and loom could earn them respect and relative freedom within their households. Those who could read and write, rare skills in a largely oral culture, sometimes became valuable advisors and record keepers, their foreign education transformed into a source of power rather than stigma. The children of these unions faced their own unique struggles that rippled through generations. Norse naming practices often reflected mixed heritage, with children receiving names that honored both their Norse fathers and hinted at their mother's origins, but the social implications were far more complex than names alone could convey. These children grew up hearing fragments of foreign languages, learning bits of Christian prayers alongside Norse mythology, and navigating identities that defied easy categorization within the rigid tribal structures of medieval Scandinavia. For the daughters of captured women, the future held particular uncertainties. Would they be considered Norse enough for advantageous marriages within the community? Would their mixed heritage make them more or less desirable as wives? Would they inherit their mother's precarious status or achieve full acceptance as members of their father's families? The answers varied dramatically based on local customs, individual circumstances, and the ever-shifting politics of Norse communities. The sons faced different but equally complex challenges. In a warrior culture that prized lineage and tribal affiliation, their mixed heritage could be either a blessing or a curse. Some leveraged their unique backgrounds to become intermediaries between Norse communities and foreign traders or diplomats. Others found their loyalty constantly questioned, never fully trusted by either their father's people or any remaining connections to their mother's origins. The documentation of these women's stories presents its own historical challenges. Norse sagas, our primary written sources for this period, were composed centuries after the events they describe and filtered through the perspectives of male chroniclers who had little interest in the experiences of captured women. Archaeological evidence provides tantalizing glimpses, but can never fully reconstruct the emotional and psychological realities of their lives. Foreign chronicles written by monks and clerics from the Christian communities that suffered Viking raids focus primarily on the violence and destruction rather than the long-term fates of those taken captive. What emerges from this fragmentary record is a picture of extraordinary human adaptability in the face of unimaginable trauma. These women developed survival strategies that required not just physical endurance, but psychological flexibility that challenges our modern understanding of identity and resilience. They learned to find meaning and purpose within systems designed to deny their humanity, to build relationships and even love within structures of oppression, and to pass on something of value to their children despite the circumstances of their own captivity. The religious transformations experienced by many captured women reveal another dimension of their adaptation strategies. Converting from Christianity to Norse paganism wasn't simply a matter of changing beliefs. It required learning entirely new ways of understanding the supernatural world, the afterlife, and humanity's relationship with divine forces. Some may have found genuine spiritual comfort in Norse religious practices, while others likely maintained their conversions as necessary performances for survival. The winter months brought their own particular hardships and opportunities. Confined to close quarters with their captors' families, these women had to navigate complex domestic relationships while managing the psychological pressure of constant proximity to those who controlled their fates. Yet these same winter months also provided opportunities for forming deeper relationships, demonstrating their value through domestic skills, and gradually earning the trust and respect that could lead to improved treatment or eventual freedom. The stories of these captured women force us to confront uncomfortable truths about survival, adaptation, and the price of human resilience. They challenge our neat categories of victim and perpetrator, showing us how the human spirit can endure and even find meaning within the most dehumanizing circumstances. These women weren't just passive casualties of Viking expansion, they became unwilling architects of the very societies that enslaved them, their children and grandchildren, eventually indistinguishable from the descendants of their captors. Their legacy extends far beyond the confines of medieval Scandinavia. In the genetic makeup of modern European populations, in the archaeological records scattered across former Viking territories, in the cultural practices that blended Christian and pagan traditions, we see the lasting impact of their forced contributions to history. They remind us that behind every great civilization's achievements lie countless untold stories of those who built that success through their suffering, their adaptation, and their remarkable ability to create life and meaning even in the darkest circumstances. Perhaps most importantly, their experiences illuminate the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit to endure, adapt, and ultimately transcend even the most brutal attempts at dehumanization. In remembering their stories, we honor not just their suffering, but their strength, and we acknowledge the complex truth that survival sometimes requires becoming someone entirely different than who we once were.